Welcome back to the podcast, everyone. Today we're talking about something that can feel a little uncomfortable for a lot of parents and caregivers, but it is so important: body safety for young children. We're focused on those early years and how we can start having simple, everyday conversations that help kids understand their bodies, their boundaries, and who they can go for if something doesn't feel right. I'm joined by one of my favorite people, our Family Support Navigator, Mary Douglas, who works closely with families in our community and has a lot of insight on how to make these conversations feel a little bit more doable. Hi, Mary.
Good morning, Karina. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being on the podcast again. I know this topic is a big topic in a lot of households and in our parenting classes. So before we dive in, do you want to give an intro for those who don't know you and maybe share a little bit about why you're on to talk about the topic?
Yeah, my name's Mary Douglas, and I'm a family support navigator with First Five. So I'm seeing a lot in Playgroup. And I am an advocate for children and a parent educator within this professional lens, but also a personal survivor of childhood sexual abuse. So I feel very dedicated to this work and trying to help families navigate this really uncomfortable and profound problem that we have.
Thank you. For everybody listening, take time and pause where you need to. Take care of yourself if it feels like a triggering topic. Mary and I are going to do our best through this interview to give real tips that are helpful and have a real and honest conversation. And it is really important to have these conversations within your household, even if they're uncomfortable. So, like I say in other episodes, sometimes it's helpful to lean into the uncomfortableness of things and find a way through it. So let's go ahead and jump in. Why is it so important to start teaching body safety as early as those early years, 3 to 5?
Yeah, like you're saying, this is a really uncomfortable topic. Adults feel uncomfortable talking about it. And then when you start to think about talking to really young kids, that just puts everyone off. But it is really their foundational years of learning. And we're building up this conversation so that it is more of a everyday thing that we can talk about. So that our children don't get this kind of birds and the bees or extreme lecture later on. We just want this to be foundational and things that they've learned from the beginning. And that is really in the lens of prevention, because unfortunately, according to the CDC, about 1 in 5 children will experience childhood sexual abuse before they turn 18, which is really, it's kind of shocking to hear that statistic and very sad, but it's something that we can work to prevent. If we start talking to them between the ages of 3 and 5, they can kind of understand that. They're pretty curious about their own bodies and they're starting to learn independence. So it's a really crucial window to start talking to them about this in.
And just a disclaimer for parents who maybe have missed this window. One thing that we always like to remind all of our parents with any topic that we talk about is that it's never too late to start those conversations.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah. Now, some of us didn't grow up in households where we talked about our body parts and about what happens to our bodies. Some of us grew up in households that were very open. But for those of us, for parents and caregivers who feel awkward talking about private body parts, if there's a one-parent household with the opposite sex kid, there's like an added level of stress. So what is a simple way to start those maybe uncomfortable conversations?
Yeah, this can be a real tricky part of starting this. And what we recommend to parents is that they try to keep it as casual as possible when they start. Keep it small, keep it short. And you can even rehearse it if you're feeling like this is going to be a triggering moment for you, which is totally understandable. But go ahead and rehearse that. We also encourage families to get books about this. There's lots of books nowadays about learning about body parts, using the correct terms. So that can be a jumping in point for a lot of parents if they need a little help with that. But keeping it casual, just talking about, we try to use the bathing suit rule, which is like if your parts are covered by a bathing suit, these are the parts that we're talking about then, but keeping it age appropriate. And like you said, if it's later on that you're starting this conversation will look a little different if you're talking to like a 10-year-old. particularly, but at 3 and 5, we just want to keep it simple and accessible to them. But again, just a neutral tone, like an everyday conversation that you're having, and keep it short.
Yeah, and one thing we always talk about is when it comes to young children, if they aren't given answers or they're not really told specific things, kids tend to make up those stories on their own and they make up their own rules about the world. So it's so important to keep things honest, simple, and probably very, very matter of fact, trying to keep shame away from things, but more so just matter of fact. I've heard that using the correct names for body parts is pretty important. Do you want to expand on that a little bit? Why does using the correct names for body parts matter?
Yeah, it's crucial that kids learn the correct names for our body parts so that they can talk to trusted adults if there is anything that comes up. But inadvertently, sometimes when we use nicknames or different names for body parts, we're teaching shame in a kind of covert way, that we can't name our body parts and just talk about them in a normal, casual way, just as you would about your arm or your leg. And it makes it taboo. And that secrecy and awkwardness bleeds over into the conversation and sometimes has children feeling less comfortable about talking about it.
So, how can parents teach young kids, especially, in this age group, that they're the boss of their bodies? Because that's essentially what we want kids to know. As we teach kids independence and body safety, we want them to know that they have autonomy of their bodies.
Absolutely. Boundaries are incredibly important to teach to children and adults. And we can do in just everyday moments by listening to our children and not forcing them to give hugs or kisses or, giving them other ideas like they can give a high five or a fist bump, but just really tuning in to your child and listening for those consent moments and following through with them. So a no is always a no, and they know that they can say no and you will stop. And also making sure that this happens within the wider context of your children, so your friends and your family. If you enforce their boundaries for them when they're young, they need that. We have to be that safety guard for them when they're young, but that teaches them that they can do that when they're older too.
Yeah, I know for me, growing up, it was like such a cultural thing that we hug and kiss everybody that comes through the door or, all our family members. And it's not something that, even as a kid, maybe you're not aware of why you don't want to do it, but you're like hesitant. So, challenging some of those cultural traditions and giving your kids an option to say, no, like I don't want to do that. And one thing we talk about on the podcast, and think it came up a couple episodes ago when we had Leah Sanders on, talking about respect and how we can respect kids' bodies by asking them permission, like you said, can I pick you up? Can I give you a kiss? Can I give you a hug? And having those conversations start with a trusted adult makes it easier for kids later on to be able to say no.
Yes. And we want to have them learn the feeling that they get when they are uncomfortable. And we can ask them about those feelings, like if you feel it in your tummy or your chest. If we want them to trust their own bodies. And we can teach that really early on by having that conversation and just pointing it out to them, or also pointing it out in ourselves, like, oh, that made me feel uncomfortable and I got a little tight, or that made me feel yucky and my stomach is off. But like pointing it out in ourselves lets them notice it in themselves too, and naming it.
That's such a great point. I think about that a lot when it comes to like helping kids understand their bodily functions, when it's like, oh, my tummy hurts, I have to go to the bathroom. And then, like you said, modeling it. And, a disclaimer that obviously every kid is different. And if there's some neurodivergency, these conversations are going to look different, especially when it comes to body reactions and being aware of the feelings in your body. So definitely adjust the conversations as you need for your kids. So Mary, you kind of touched on it a little bit already. Like, are there any other things you want to mention about like a simple way to explain private parts to young kids?
Yeah, so we use the bathing suit rule as a really concrete way for preschoolers to visualize this. If it's covered up by a bathing suit, those are your private parts. And we tell them that no one is allowed to touch those places. And then there are exceptions like doctors and parents, but they're going to tell you first what's going on. They're going to ask permission and they can say no. And respecting that and having those clear boundaries. And the bathing suit rule is just an easier way for preschoolers to kind of digest that and have that visual of a physical boundary, right? Because we want to teach this in just little moments throughout the day that we trust their boundaries and we trust them to be their own boss and to say what they like and don't like.
Is there a way that we can have, now we're teaching kids about their private parts, respect, being the boss of their bodies. Is there a way that you can explain to them the difference between necessary touches, like a doctor's visit with a parent present, or unsafe touch?
Absolutely. I think that we can definitely teach kids about, sometimes it's called safe touch versus unsafe touch, or wanted touch or unwanted touch. And we can talk to them about that. But it also is going back to that conversation. We're going to ask questions like, what do you think about this touch? How would you feel? Does this make you uncomfortable? And that really opens it up so that we are listening to our kids and then can kind of guide from there. But again, going back to that conversation, make it normal and casual and something that you do kind of ongoing. Parents are always and doctors should always ask beforehand and explain why they're doing this. And it's not in a secretive way. If someone is saying, don't tell your parent or whoever that this happened, then that's a cue that this is unsafe. It should be out in the open. The children should be allowed to ask questions and know what's going on.
Yeah. And I think that brings like an important point and something that I know when we are out in parenting classes kind of comes up. The importance of teaching our kids that unsafe behavior can come from someone that the child knows. It's not always stranger danger. It can be someone in the household. It could be someone in the family unit, family friends. Do you have anything you want to add to that? Like why it's so important to teach that unsafe behavior can come from someone that the child knows, not just strangers?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, unfortunately, it's shown that about 90% of sexual abuse occurs within close family ties. So someone that the child knows. So, the kind of old school teaching of stranger danger really is not applicable to children's experiences. And we need to help them learn that it's okay to talk about these things, even with people that they are around a lot, and that we are going to believe them when they talk to us. A good entryway to talk about it is with family or friends that you might not like a behavior that they do, and it might not be as extreme as this, but say cousin Freddie often likes to wrestle and punch and it goes too far. We can say, yeah, I really don't like when Freddie punches me in the stomach. That doesn't feel good. But I also have fun with him later on. But in that moment, I don't like that behavior. And that is a very complex kind of conversation and viewpoint, but these things can be true at the same time and often are. And so if we do it in a kind of lighter dose with people that we know, then it can help children bridge that gap if something does come up.
Yeah. And I think one thing that speaks to is like sometimes we don't give kids enough credit that they understand what's going on around them. They might not have the language, but they tend to know when something doesn't feel okay. And kind of like what you've been saying is if we model that behavior to voice it, they're more likely to be able to voice it as well.
Yeah.
And so with this kind of comes the idea of teaching them the difference between maybe a safe surprise and an unsafe secret. You kind of touched on it a little bit, but how do we help kids understand that difference so that, they're open to those conversations?
Yeah, this comes up a bit because like we do sometimes have our children keep secrets, but it's that safe secret that you're talking about, which is a surprise. And in the end, a surprise is revealed like a birthday present. It comes to light. A secret, an unsafe secret, is when it is never allowed to come to light and people aren't going to know about it. And even more so if they're threatened to keep this a secret, if they feel they will come or someone else will be harmed if they don't keep this a secret. That's when it's unsafe.
Yeah, it's making me think of being able to be a regulated adult when your kid maybe snitches or says, tells or tattles or says a secret or something like that. Because sometimes we might not be in a regulated state when somebody says something. And it might teach, your kid that, okay, I need to keep a secret because I don't want to get in trouble. So having even just saying that out loud, if you tell a secret, you won't be in trouble. But you have to remember, we don't keep secrets from mom and dad. How can parents help their kids identify trusted adults that they can talk to? Because sometimes maybe kids might feel closer to their aunt or their big sister or something. What
Yeah,
do we teach kids?
it's so important that we diversify the safety net for kids. So we often suggest that they have 5 safe adults that they can go and talk to. And it's pretty easy to use your hands. We can, with little kids, point to your fingers and name 5 adults that they feel comfortable with. We want it to be someone that's close within the family, like a older sister or brother, and then a little further out, aunties, uncles, grandparents, and then even further out, we have preschool teachers, other parents of their friends. The list is going to change, but this is a great conversation to come back to, even up into high school. We want them to have at least 5 people that they feel comfortable talking to them about. And again, in this conversation, we can kind of guide them if they're having trouble coming up with those, kind of cue them in to people that we trust and we know would protect our kids.
So while we're explaining the difference between, that surprise and secret, are there signs that might show a child is being asked to keep an unsafe secret or that something has happened?
Yeah, some of the red flags can be regression in behaviors like potty training regression or bedwetting, sucking a thumb, other coping mechanisms like baby talk or separation anxiety can show up. Sudden fears can often show up about people or places that weren't typical for that child earlier on. They're all of a sudden they seem scared to go to a certain place or be with someone. That's a red flag. Hypervigilance or withdrawal. So again, it's kind of like the adults, we can go into these camps of being really protective and reactive or complacent. And this can show up with children too, around normal things that they typically like to do, like being with friends or at school. So somatic complaints also can come up. So stomach cramps, headaches, they can kind of manifest in a physical way. Changes in children's sleeping patterns is a big one. They can have like night terrors and refusing to go to sleep in their own bed, being fearful. Other signs might be sexual behavior or language that is uncommon for that age. If children know about certain sexual acts that you haven't discussed previously, but they start talking about them, or sometimes children kind of reenact the sexual trauma in a play setting, having their dolls do it, or even acting it out themselves. In conversations with our kiddos, sometimes they drop hints about unsafe behavior that might have happened. They get really short with their answers. They look away. Often it's body language. They look uncomfortable physically. Or other times, kiddos might test out the water, for instance, like say, hey, I've got this friend that doesn't really feel comfortable with our coach in basketball anymore. What do you think that my friend should do?
Oh, that makes sense. Like you said, testing out the water or maybe putting it like on a story or something.
Yeah.
Or making up an imaginative tale. And that's when you can start kind of asking, where is that coming from? So if a child does share something concerning to one of the safe adults, whether it's a parent or someone, what's the most important thing for a parent to do in that moment?
So the hardest and most vital thing an adult can do is to stay calm and not reactive. And this is so difficult if you're ever faced with this moment, but it's something to practice how you'll respond to something really triggering or potentially devastating to the family comes up and how you're going to react to that news. And then there are three kind of scripted things you can say. Even if you're not feeling calm inside, you can have this script to go with. So it's, I believe you. And then I'm so proud of you for telling me and being brave. So you're validating them for even coming to you. And then this is not your fault, and I'm going to help keep you safe. Those are the three things, the script that we can tell them. And then we can move forward with what we're going to do. But helping ourselves stay regulated will help the child regulate, and then we can move forward.
Do you have any tips on parents or caregivers and how they can regulate themselves so that they don't react with panic or anger if a child discloses something or having these conversations?
This can be particularly tricky for parents that have their own history of sexual abuse as a child. From my own experience and from what I've learned is that we often fit into two categories where we're hyper fixated on keeping our children safe. And we can be really reactive in that state, or the opposite, which is to kind of tune out and ignore it all because it's too hard to deal with. So in both of those scenarios, there's a lot of work that parents, honestly, we need to do on our own in a healing journey so that we can help break this cycle, because clearly both of those don't want this to, no one wants what we experience to happen to our own children. The first step is to recognize why this conversation is so tricky for us. And once we can understand and kind of lean into that discomfort, like you were talking about, then we're able to kind of separate our own story from what's happening in the moment. We want to show up as the adult we need as a kid that can help protect and keep our children safe. And we want that in our community at large, but this is how we can break this cycle.
What's one thing you want every parent listening to remember about body safety?
So abuse thrives in silence and secrecy. So the silence often forces kids to protect the abuser. And that's the opposite of what we want to be having. So these conversations that we have with them can be matter of fact, but bringing this up in a non-judgmental space can really help that the secrecy come to light. Speaking the truth, whether it's with a therapist or a parent or a survivor group, takes the power out of that silence and secrecy and begins to lessen the shame for everyone, including yourself, but for your kiddos too, because it's too much for one person to carry, and that's where the trauma really inflicts damage on us all, is that we try to carry it all by ourselves. Making it out loud doesn't have to be sharing the story to everyone in a really uncomfortable way. It can be finding that moment of vulnerability and safety with your own child within that conversation to help share maybe a painful experience that you've had so that your child feels more safe opening up to you, and making that the norm in the family, that's acceptable and that's the culture in your home. So when they have to navigate a vulnerable or painful experience, they've had experience on the other side of that with you.
That was really beautifully said, Mary. And, this topic in general is challenging, but having vulnerable conversations and trying to be, the best parent you can be and do all of the things can feel overwhelming. Let me make sure I'm saying my feelings out loud. Let me make sure I'm sharing. Nobody is perfect, and finding teachable moments is what it's all about. So whether it's, once in a while you have an opportunity to share about a difficult experience or moment you're going through, that is good enough. That is okay. I just want to remind all of our listeners not to feel like you have to put a lot of pressure on. Our goal is to keep our families safe and secure and happy, and having difficult conversations is a part of that, unfortunately. But we're hoping that these are at least some tips that can help navigate this topic.
So unfortunately, we can't protect our children from the harsh reality of the world. Bad things are going to happen to them. But what we can do is make sure that they have a safety net and they have a safe haven to go back to, and that they have these conversations with us and we have them with them. And we experience harsh things in our life and they help us through that. And we have this built-in protection within our families.
Beautifully said, Mary. I think one of the things that always speaks to me when we talk about kids is that raising confident kids who have been taught respect, respecting themselves, respecting others, um, who are surrounded by a community that makes them feel that they're worthy, really makes such a difference in how kids show up in the future.
Thank you so much for bringing this to our listeners, Karina. This is such a really important topic and it's so heavy, but it is all about conversation. And we're starting this right now and having it out to families, resources to them that they can utilize, and knowing that they're not alone and that this is tricky. We're showing up as the adults that we needed, and this is how we do it. This is the beginning. So thank you for doing this.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you for being here and taking the time. If you want to catch more of Mary, be sure to check out our Playgroup so you can have one-on-one conversations with her. If you have any questions about difficult topics, Mary makes it very easy and she's very approachable. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your insights today. This topic can feel big, but it really comes down to small, ongoing conversations that help build trust and confidence in our kids over time. If you're listening and feeling unsure, just remember, you don't have to do it perfectly. Starting the conversation is what matters most. We'll share some additional resources and support for families in the show notes. And as always, thank you for being here and for all the ways you show up for your children and the community.